The night was late, but the city streets still shimmered faintly under the pale golden glow of flickering streetlights. A soft drizzle kissed the pavement, turning it slick and reflective, as shadows of bare-branched trees swayed like ghostly dancers in the damp air. Emily Carter moved quickly through the quiet, her heart swollen with a radiant joy that seemed to light her from within. She had just finished her first solo piano performance at the Madison Concert Hall, a milestone that felt like a dream carved from years of practice and hope. Her pristine white dress, delicate and flowing, caught the faint gleam of the lights with every step, its hem fluttering like a whisper of the melodies she'd played. In her hand, she clutched the concert program, a crumpled but cherished token of her triumph, its ink still crisp with the promise of her name in bold letters. The air was sharp and chilly, but Emily barely noticed. Inside, she was warm, wrapped in the echo of the audience's applause and the lingering notes of Chopin that danced through her mind as if her fingers were still brushing the keys. Each step she took along the empty street felt like an extension of her performance, a quiet encore played out on the wet asphalt. Pride sparkled in her dark eyes, not just for her own achievement, but for the unwavering love of her father, Nathan Carter, whose encouragement had carried her to this moment. That morning, before she'd left home, Nathan had sat with her in their small, cozy kitchen, his hands steady and gentle as he wove her hair into intricate, elegant braids. It was a ritual reserved for special occasions, a labor of love that he performed with quiet focus. "This hair is your crown, Emily," he'd said, his deep voice soft but firm, his eyes shining with a pride that made her feel invincible. "Tonight, you'll be the brightest star." To Emily, those braids were more than just a hairstyle. They were a thread of connection to her father, a tangible symbol of his care, his belief in her. Standing before the mirror that morning, she'd smiled at her reflection, feeling regal, like a princess stepping into a storybook. Now, as she walked home, that same sense of royalty lingered, her head held high despite the late hour and the empty streets. But the glow of her perfect night was about to dim. Behind her, the low hum of an engine cut through the stillness, and the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car pierced the soft ambiance of Maple Street. Emily's steps faltered as unease prickled at the edges of her joy. She turned her head slightly, catching the glare of headlights in her peripheral vision, and her fingers tightened around the concert program as if it could shield her from whatever was coming. Behind the wheel sat Lisa Harper, a middle-aged policewoman whose years on the force had hardened her into something unyielding. Lisa's shift had been long. Endless hours of paperwork, petty complaints, and the weight of a city that never slept, and her patience had worn thin, leaving her irritable and sharp-edged. Through the rain-streaked windshield, her tired eyes landed on Emily, a young black girl in a white dress, her intricately braided hair catching the light in a way that seemed almost defiant. Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. "A girl like that, out here this late? That hairstyle? Looks gang-related," she muttered to herself, suspicion coiling in her chest like a snake. She eased the car to a crawl, her mind already spinning a narrative that had no basis in truth, and after a moment's hesitation, she pulled over. The headlights blazed directly into Emily's path, freezing her in place like a deer caught in a hunter's sights. Lisa rolled down her window, her voice slicing through the night with cold authority. "Stop right there! What are you doing out here at this hour?" Emily turned fully, startled by the harshness of the tone. Her heart thudded against her ribs, but she kept her composure, clutching the program tighter. "I just finished a piano performance at the Madison Concert Hall," she said, her voice soft but steady, tinged with the caution of someone who knew how quickly words could be twisted. "I live just a few blocks away." Lisa barely registered the explanation. She swung the car door open and stepped out, her heavy boots striking the wet pavement with a dull, menacing thud that echoed in the quiet. Her posture radiated control, her shoulders squared as if she were a wall about to close in. "Let me see your ID," she demanded, her gaze raking over Emily from head to toe, lingering on the braids with a flicker of disdain. Emily took a small step back, the unease now blooming into something heavier, something that pressed against her chest. "May I ask why, ma'am?" she said, her tone still calm, though her fingers trembled slightly around the program. "I'm just walking home. I haven't done anything wrong." Lisa's eyes narrowed, her irritation flaring at Emily's quiet defiance. The girl's composure only fueled her suspicion, as if calmness were a crime in itself. "Don't play games with me," Lisa snapped, her voice icy and cutting. "That hairstyle, don't tell me it's not gang-related. Do you think I don't know better?" Emily froze, the words landing like a slap. The braids her father had crafted with such care, the ones he'd called her crown, were now being twisted into something ugly, something criminal. Her chest tightened, a mix of hurt and anger rising in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "This is the hairstyle my father did for me this morning," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "It has nothing to do with gangs." Lisa's expression didn't soften. She stepped closer, her presence looming, and snatched Emily's bag from her shoulder with a swift, practiced motion. "Obstructing an investigation," she barked, pulling a pair of handcuffs from her belt with a metallic clink that rang out in the damp air. "If you don't cooperate, I'll take you to the station." Emily's breath caught, a lump forming in her throat, but she refused to let the tears spill. She stood still, the rain beginning to fall harder now, blurring the edges of her white dress and the braids that framed her face. The concert program in her hand was her last tether to the night she'd had, a night that was now slipping away into something dark and unrecognizable. Lisa's grip tightened on her arm, pulling her toward the patrol car, the cold steel of the handcuffs brushing against Emily's wrist as they clicked into place. "You don't understand," Emily said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I didn't do anything wrong." Lisa turned back, her eyes like flint. "Silence would be better for you," she replied, her lips a grim slash across her face, as if Emily's words were an inconvenience she refused to entertain. The rain pounded harder as Emily sat on a hard bench in the police station's holding area, her soaked dress clinging to her legs, the intricate braids now heavy and dripping. The crumpled concert program lay discarded on the floor, its proud lettering smeared beyond recognition, a cruel mirror of the night's unraveling. Humiliation stung her, sharp and relentless, but she held her head high, refusing to let them see her break. Across the room, Lisa stood behind a desk, her pen scratching across paperwork under the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights. Her face was a mask of indifference, as if the scene before her were just another routine task. "This girl isn't cooperating," she muttered to Mike, a younger officer leaning against the wall, his arms crossed. "That hairstyle, gang-related, I'm telling you." Mike shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowing as he glanced at Emily. He was new to the force, still green enough to feel the weight of doubt, but he said nothing, his silence a quiet complicity. Unbeknownst to them, the storm brewing wasn't just in the rain outside. From a distance, a man in a black suit had watched it all unfold, his sharp features shadowed beneath an umbrella, his piercing eyes missing nothing. Nathan Carter's hands gripped the handle tightly, his knuckles whitening as he replayed the scene in his mind. His daughter, his pride, reduced to a figure in handcuffs. In his pocket, his phone held a video of the encounter, every word and action captured in stark clarity. Nathan wasn't just a father. He was a man with power, a covert operative whose work had saved countless lives. And now that power surged through him, a quiet fury building as he prepared to turn the tables. When Nathan stormed into the station, the air shifted. His presence was a force, calm, deliberate, but crackling with authority. Lisa looked up, her pen pausing mid-scratch, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Nathan's voice was low, controlled, but it carried the weight of a man who knew the scales of justice better than most. "You've made a mistake," he said, his eyes locking onto Lisa's, "and you're about to learn what happens when you abuse the power you've been given." What followed was swift and merciless. With a few calls, Nathan unraveled Lisa's world, her badge stripped, her actions exposed, her career reduced to ashes. But it wasn't just punishment. It was a lesson a stark reminder that justice, when wielded wrongly, carries consequences that echo far beyond the moment. For Emily, reclaiming her dignity was a quieter battle. As she stood beside her father, the rain still dripping from her braids, she felt the weight of the night begin to lift. The braids, once a symbol of humiliation, became her crown again, proof of her strength, her father's love, and the truth that no act of cruelty could erase. In the end, the city lights still glimmered, but for Emily and Nathan, they shone with a deeper promise, that even in the darkest moments justice could prevail and the powerless could rise. The rain poured relentlessly outside, drumming against the pavement in a steady, mournful rhythm that mirrored the unease settling over the quiet police station. Nearby, a young officer named Mike stood hesitantly, his broad shoulders slumping as he cast a sidelong glance at Emily. His brow creased with uncertainty, his dark eyes flickering with doubt as he wrestled with the words forming in his throat. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and tentative, barely audible over the patter of the storm. "Lisa, she's just a student. She doesn't strike me as someone dangerous. Does protocol really have to—" Before he could finish, Lisa, a stern figure with a rigid posture and a face carved from unyielding resolve, cut him off with a sharp, dismissive bark. "Protocol is protocol, Mike," she snapped, her tone as cold and unfeeling as the wet night beyond the station's walls. "If we start bending the rules for every little sob story, we'll miss something big. Who knows what she's tangled up in? You can't trust appearances." Her words carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much, or perhaps too little, and had let suspicion harden into an unshakable creed. Lisa turned abruptly, her boots squeaking on the slick floor as she faced Emily, who stood drenched and defiant under the station's awning. The officer's icy stare bore into the girl like a spotlight, searching for cracks in her composure. "I told you to hand over your bag," Lisa said, her voice clipped and commanding. "You refused. That's why you're here now. Your stubbornness only makes me wonder what you're hiding." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and pointed, as the wind howled outside, tugging at the edges of Emily's soaked dress. Emily lifted her chin, meeting Lisa's gaze with a quiet strength that belied her fragile frame. Her large, luminous eyes, deep pools of hazel flecked with gold, held steady, unblinking despite the rain dripping from her lashes. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, the kind that steadies a racing heart, and spoke with a voice soft, yet resolute. "I haven't done anything wrong. My bag just has my sheet music and the program from tonight's performance. They're all I have from it. If they get wet, they'll be ruined. Everything I worked for, gone." Her words weren't a plea. They were a statement, a line drawn in the sand by someone who refused to be broken. But Lisa remained a stone wall, her expression unchanging, her mind already made up. Without a word, she stepped forward, her movements swift and decisive, and seized Emily's bag from her grasp. Emily's hands shot out instinctively, a fleeting tug of war erupting as she tried to hold on, not out of guilt, but out of desperation to protect the fragile remnants of her night. That resistance only fueled Lisa's fire. "Obstructing an officer!" she bellowed, her voice slicing through the storm like a whip. In one fluid motion, she pulled a pair of handcuffs from her belt, the metal glinting ominously under the station's dim lights. With a sharp, chilling click, the cuffs snapped around Emily's wrists, the sound reverberating through the stillness like a gunshot. Emily froze, her body trembling not from fear but from the cold rain soaking through her thin dress. Inside, a storm of her own brewed, a deep, aching humiliation that clawed at her chest, threatening to swallow her whole. Yet she stood tall, her posture unbroken, her head held high as rivulets of water traced paths down her pale cheeks. She wouldn't give Lisa the satisfaction of seeing her spirit crumble, not even as the cuffs bit into her skin. Inside the station, the holding room was a stark, unforgiving box of concrete and steel. Emily sat on a frigid metal chair, her soaked dress clinging to her like a second skin, her once neat hair now a tangled mess plastered to her scalp. The handcuffs rested heavily in her lap, a constant reminder of her powerlessness. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, casting a harsh, clinical glow that made the room feel more like a cage than a refuge. The air was thick with tension, oppressive and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Lisa stood just outside, her pen scratching across detention forms with mechanical precision, her face a mask of indifference. Nearby, Mike lingered by the door, his tall frame slouched against the wall. He stole glances at Emily through the wire mesh window, his jaw tight, his hazel eyes clouded with unease. He didn't like this, not the cuffs, not the coldness of it all, but he held his tongue, trapped between duty and a gnawing sense of wrongness he couldn't shake. Lisa paused mid-form, her sharp voice cutting through the hum of the station. "Get the barber down here," she called to a desk officer, a wiry man with tired eyes who flinched at her tone. "We need to deal with this hair situation, now." Mike's head snapped up, disbelief flashing across his face as he stepped closer. "Lisa, are you serious? She's not a criminal. It's just a hairstyle. You're taking this too far." "Protocol!" Lisa shot back, her voice a steel blade. "That style could signal gang ties. We eliminate risks, period." Her words were final, leaving no room for debate, though Mike's silence screamed his dissent. Soon, George, a middle-aged barber with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face, shuffled into the room, his toolkit clinking softly in his hands. His kind eyes, framed by faint crow's feet, landed on Emily, and his breath caught in his throat. She was so young, so delicate, her sharp cheekbones and steady gaze a stark contrast to the bleakness around her. This wasn't like the rough men or hardened troublemakers he'd been called to groom in this place before. She didn't belong here, not in this cold, unforgiving space. "This young girl?" he asked, his voice thick with hesitation and a quiet, aching compassion. "Yes," Lisa replied, her tone as frigid as the room. "Cut it all off, it's protocol." George faltered, his calloused fingers tightening around his scissors as he turned to Emily. She sat still, her cuffed hands resting calmly in her lap, her eyes meeting his, not with fear or desperation, but with an unshakable resolve that made his chest ache. He stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, his touch warm against the chill of her skin. "I'm so sorry, dear," he murmured, his voice trembling with regret. "I don't want to do this, but they've got me backed into a corner." "I have to follow orders." Emily tilted her head up to him, her voice steady as a rock despite the storm raging inside her. "I understand. Go ahead. I'll be fine." Her words were a lifeline for George, a quiet permission that eased his guilt just enough to move forward. The first snip of the scissors rang out, sharp and final, slicing through the silence like a blade through flesh. The intricate braids her father had woven that morning, each one a labor of love, a symbol of pride, fell to the floor in soft, defeated clumps. Emily's heart twisted with every cut, each strand a piece of her dignity severed and discarded. George's hands shook as he worked, pausing often to steady himself, his eyes glistening with tears he refused to let fall. Behind him, Lisa loomed like a shadow, her gaze cold and unrelenting, urging him on whenever he faltered. Emily fixed her eyes on the small, cracked mirror bolted to the wall, watching as her reflection transformed. Strand by strand, she saw herself stripped away, her identity, her strength, her pride, reduced to a pile of soggy hair at her feet. But she didn't cry. She wouldn't. Instead, she locked eyes with Lisa through the glass, her stare burning with a quiet, unyielding defiance that sent a shiver down the officer's spine. For a fleeting moment, Lisa felt something shift, a flicker of unease, a crack in her armor. This wasn't the broken submission she'd expected. It was the gaze of someone who'd remember, someone who'd endure. When the last braid hit the ground, the room drowned in a heavy, unsettling silence. Emily bent slowly, her movements deliberate despite the cuffs, and gathered the fallen braids into her lap. She cradled them tenderly, as if they were fragile relics of a life she refused to let slip away. George stepped back, his breath ragged, his eyes brimming with sorrow, as he wiped his hands on his apron. Lisa turned on her heel and strode out, her boots echoing down the hall, but she couldn't outrun the knot tightening in her chest, a growing dread she couldn't name. Outside the holding room, Mike leaned against the desk, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Lisa as she disappeared around the corner. His silence was louder than any protest, a quiet judgment that weighed heavily in the air. Inside, Emily remained on the chair, her cropped hair jagged and uneven, her dress still dripping onto the floor. But her eyes, those steady, unflinching eyes, held a fire that refused to be extinguished. She clutched her braids tighter, her fingers tracing the familiar patterns, and felt the sting of loss deep in her core. This wasn't the end, she knew. It was only the beginning. The station hummed with its usual rhythm, but beneath it lay an eerie stillness, a tension that clung to the walls like damp rot. Lisa stood by her desk, staring blankly at the forms in front of her, her pen hovering over the page. Her face betrayed nothing, no regret, no doubt, but her mind churned with the image of Emily's unbroken spirit. It lingered there, haunting her like a ghost she couldn't banish. She didn't know it yet, but her actions had set something unstoppable in motion, a ripple that would grow into a wave she couldn't outrun. Then, with a sudden thunderous crash, the front doors of the station burst open, shattering the fragile quiet. Captain Thomas Monroe stormed in, his towering frame filling the doorway, his presence as commanding as a tempest. His boots thudded against the tiled floor, each step a declaration of authority that sent a ripple of unease through the room. Officers scattered, their eyes darting away as they busied themselves with meaningless tasks, desperate to avoid the intensity of his gaze. Monroe's sharp, steel-gray eyes swept the station, narrowing as they landed on Lisa's desk. "Harper!" His deep voice sliced through the air like a guillotine, stopping her cold. "Who did you bring in?" Lisa straightened, her composure unshaken despite the weight of his tone. "A girl?" she said casually, brushing off the gravity of the moment. "Caught her walking late at night in this area. Looked suspicious. Her hairstyle might have been gang-related, so I followed protocol." She shrugged, a faint flicker of uncertainty creeping into her voice as she tried to justify herself. Monroe's brows furrowed, his expression darkening as he took a deliberate step closer. "What's her name?" he asked, his voice low and edged with a warning that made the air feel heavier. Lisa rifled through the papers on her desk, her fingers steady despite the tremor she felt building inside. "Emily Carter," she replied, glancing up. "A student, but protocol." The name hit Monroe like a punch to the gut. His face shifted, shock, then fury, before he slammed his hands onto her desk, leaning in so close she could feel the heat of his anger. "What did you just say?" he growled, his voice a dangerous whisper that sent a chill down her spine. "Emily Carter," Lisa repeated, slower this time, her confidence wavering as the weight of his reaction sank in. Monroe exhaled sharply, his breath ragged with a mix of rage and disbelief. He straightened, pulling out his phone with a trembling hand, his movements jerky as he swiped through the screen. Whatever he saw there only deepened the storm in his eyes. Lisa didn't know it yet, but she'd crossed a line, one that would teach her a brutal lesson about justice and the consequences of wielding power without restraint. Emily, still seated in that cold, unforgiving room, wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a spark, and the fire was coming. Nathan Monroe's fingers hovered over the sleek surface of his phone, hesitating for only a heartbeat before he tapped the screen and brought it to his ear. His voice was sharp, clipped, and carried an urgency that sliced through the quiet hum of the precinct. "Nathan, you need to get here now," he said, the words tumbling out like shards of broken glass before he ended the call with a decisive jab. He turned back to Lisa Monroe, his posture rigid, his face carved from stone. The air between them grew thick with tension as his cold, unyielding gaze locked onto her. "Do you even comprehend the magnitude of what you've done, Harper?" His tone was severe, each syllable dripping with accusation. "Emily Carter isn't just some random kid you can toy with. She's the daughter of Nathan Carter, a federal agent buried deep in one of the most perilous undercover operations of his career." Lisa froze mid-breath, her chest tightening as though an iron band had clamped around it. Her wide eyes flickered with disbelief, her lips parting slightly as she stammered, "The daughter of a federal agent?" The words felt foreign, heavy on her tongue, as the realization sank into her bones like icy water seeping through cracks. Monroe's response was a bark, harsh and unforgiving, cutting through her shock. "That's right. For 3 grueling years, Nathan has been worming his way into Richard Grayson's network, one of the most ruthless criminal empires this country has ever seen. Every step forward he's clawed out, every fragile thread of trust he's woven, every life teetering on the edge. It could all unravel because of your careless, reckless stupidity." Her mind spun wildly, a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts crashing against one another. Lisa's throat tightened as she tried to muster a defense, her voice trembling. I was just following protocol. The hairstyle." Before she could finish, Monroe's fury erupted like a volcano. He slammed both palms onto the desk with a thunderous bang, the sound ricocheting off the precinct walls. Nearby officers flinched, their heads snapping toward the commotion, but Monroe didn't care. "Protocol!" he roared, his voice a tempest of rage. "You think your petty rules gave you the right to chop off an innocent girl's hair based on some half-baked, ignorant hunch? You've just handed Grayson a golden ticket to question Nathan's loyalty." He sank into his chair, the weight of the situation etching deep lines into his weathered face. His fingers fumbled with a manila folder, pulling out a stack of glossy photos that he flung across the desk toward Lisa. "Look at this," he ordered, his voice low and grim, a stark contrast to his earlier outburst. Lisa's hands shook as she reached for the top photo, her fingertips brushing the cold surface. The image revealed Richard Grayson, a man whose presence oozed menace even through the stillness of a photograph. Beside him stood Victor Steele, his right-hand man, whose sharp, predatory eyes seemed to bore straight through her, sending a shiver racing down her spine. She could almost feel the chill of his stare, the unspoken threat lingering in his posture. "Grayson's not just some small-time crook peddling drugs," Monroe continued, his voice heavy with the burden of truth. "He's neck-deep in human trafficking, arms smuggling, money laundering, you name it. He's got an army of slimy lawyers, crooked cops, and even politicians dancing to his tune. And now, because of you, he's sniffing around Nathan. If he connects the dots and finds out Emily's his daughter, it's not just Nathan's life on the line, his whole family's in the crosshairs." Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out everything else. Lisa struggled to hold herself together, her composure fracturing like brittle glass. I didn't know," she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to—" Monroe cut her off, his sarcasm sharp enough to draw blood. "Oh, you didn't mean to? You think that erases the fallout? If Grayson makes a move now, we lose our one shot to take him down. Years of work, gone. Just like that." The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in as guilt coiled tighter around her chest. An hour later, the staccato rhythm of hurried footsteps echoed through the precinct's sterile hallway, a sound that snapped Lisa out of her spiraling thoughts. Nathan Carter strode in, his dark suit pristine despite the chaos he carried within. His steel-gray eyes glinted with a cold intensity, his jaw set in a hard line as he made a beeline for the holding area. When the metal door creaked open, he spotted Emily perched on a rickety chair, her small frame dwarfed by the stark surroundings. Her eyes, though weary, burned with a quiet resilience that tugged at something deep in his chest. "Emily," Nathan said, his deep voice softening with a father's worry as it wrapped around her name like a shield. She looked up and, for a fleeting moment, her guarded expression melted, a faint spark of relief lighting her face. "I'm okay, Dad," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "I'm strong." Nathan crouched down, his knees brushing the cold concrete floor as he met her gaze. His hand reached out, gentle yet trembling with suppressed rage, to touch the jagged ends of her once-long braids. The sight of her shorn hair ignited a dark fire in his eyes, a fury he barely held in check. "I'll make this right," he vowed, his words firm and unyielding, a promise carved in stone. Rising to his feet, he left the room with purpose, his strides long and deliberate as he approached Lisa. His gaze locked onto her, piercing and unrelenting, like a predator sizing up its prey. He studied her silently for a moment, as if peeling back the layers of her mind to expose every hidden thought. "Lisa Harper," he said at last, his voice low and laced with menace, each syllable a dagger aimed at her conscience. "Do you grasp the consequences of what you've done?" Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Nathan's intensity stole her breath, her words dying in her throat. 3 years, he continued, his voice cutting through the silence with surgical precision. 3 years of building trust with Grayson and his crew. Every day, I've walked a razor's edge. And now, because of your prejudiced, bone-headed decision, he's starting to doubt me. If I die, if my daughter gets hurt again, it's on you. Lisa's legs buckled beneath her, her knees threatening to give way as his words sank in, heavy as lead. I'll do anything to fix this, she stammered, desperation clawing at her voice. Nathan arched a brow, his icy stare unwavering. Fix it? You might not get the chance. Monroe stepped in, his broad frame cutting through the charged air. We'll deal with this later, he said gruffly, then turned to Lisa, his eyes hard. You're suspended. Effective immediately. Nathan, focus on what's next. With that, Lisa crumpled into a nearby chair, her body sagging as if every ounce of strength had been siphoned out of her. Her hands shook violently as she buried her face in them, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Panic and regret clawed at her insides, a relentless tide that refused to recede. What had she done? Emily's face flashed in her mind, those tear-streaked yet defiant eyes haunting her like a ghost that wouldn't rest. The guilt surged, a tidal wave that obliterated every flimsy excuse she'd clung to. Deep down, she knew she hadn't just wounded Emily. She'd put an entire operation at risk, a mission forged through years of sacrifice, now teetering on the brink because of her impulsive arrogance. Pacing the room like a trapped animal, Lisa felt the weight of her choices bearing down harder with every step. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her with the reality she couldn't escape. Every moment of that night replayed in vivid detail, the metallic click of the handcuffs locking around Emily's wrists, the snip of the scissors slicing through her braids, the girl's steady, unyielding gaze that pierced through Lisa's bravado. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice breaking under the strain. Her actions hadn't been about justice or duty. They'd been about flexing her misplaced authority, a fleeting power trip born from weakness. In that single, shameful instant, she'd betrayed the very principles she'd sworn to protect. Standing by the window, Lisa stared out at the faint glow of streetlights flickering in the distance. The world beyond the glass rolled on, oblivious to the wreckage she'd left in her wake. But for her, everything had shifted. She hadn't just failed her duty, she'd betrayed her own humanity. There was no undoing it now. The only question gnawing at her was whether she could muster the courage to make amends, or if the damage was already irreparable. The wall clock ticked relentlessly, each second a hammer striking the anvil of her guilt, a reminder that time marched forward while she remained trapped in a chasm of regret she might never climb out of. Days later, an urgent summons dragged Lisa back to the precinct. Her heart thudded painfully with every step toward the meeting room, each footfall heavier than the last, as if she were trudging through quicksand. The weight of her mistakes loomed over her, a storm cloud ready to burst. When she stepped inside, Nathan's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Do you understand what you've done, Harper?" he asked, his tone low and commanding, carrying the authority of a man who'd stared into the abyss and refused to blink. Lisa's eyes dropped to the scuffed tabletop, unable to meet the fire in his gaze. I know I screwed up," she faltered, her voice trembling. "But I didn't think—" "You're right," Nathan interrupted, his voice booming like thunder rolling across a darkened sky. "You didn't think. You didn't think about the consequences. You didn't think about my daughter's safety. You didn't think about the criminal empire I've spent years trying to tear apart." Lisa stayed silent, her excuses crumbling to dust. But beneath Nathan's fury, she caught a flicker of something else, a glimmer of hope, a chance he was extending despite everything. "You've got an opportunity to redeem yourself," he said, his tone cooling but no less firm. "It won't be easy, and I wouldn't trust anyone else with it." Her head snapped up, eyes wide with a mix of dread and curiosity. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steadier now, clinging to the lifeline he offered. Nathan slid a thick file across the table, its edges worn from use, and as it landed in front of her, she knew this was more than a task. It was a reckoning, a chance to face the justice she'd so carelessly disregarded and the consequences of power abused. The air in the room grew thick as Nathan pulled back the folder's worn cover, revealing a series of grainy photographs pinned inside. Each image captured Victor Steele, Richard Grayson's steely-eyed, unrelenting right-hand man, his sharp features cutting through the shadows like a blade. Lisa's breath hitched as Nathan's voice, low and urgent, broke the silence. "After what you did, Grayson's losing faith in me," he said, his fingers tightening around the folder's edge. "He's digging into every thread tied to my name, my contacts, my allies, even Emily. If we don't move quickly, he'll unravel everything. My cover, our mission, all of it." His dark eyes met hers, heavy with the weight of what he was asking. "I need you to get close to Victor Steele. Win him over." Lisa's stomach twisted into a tight knot, her pulse hammering in her ears like a drumbeat she couldn't silence. Victor Steele wasn't just a name whispered in the underworld. He was a legend, a man they called the human lie detector. His reputation preceded him. Cold, calculating, and mercilessly perceptive, he could spot a lie before it even left your lips. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry as sandpaper. "You want me to cozy up to him?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. Nathan's nod was curt, unwavering. "You're perfect for this, Lisa. You're a cop. Disillusioned, jaded after what happened with Emily. Grayson will buy it. If you can crack Victor's armor, you'll get us a straight shot at Grayson himself." A shiver raced down Lisa's spine, cold and sharp, as if someone had traced an icicle along her back. Victor wasn't just dangerous. He was a predator, infamous for dismantling anyone foolish enough to cross his path. Yet beneath her fear, a flicker of something else stirred. Resolve. This could be her chance to right the wrongs clawing at her conscience, to undo the damage she'd caused. "And if I slip up?" she pressed, her voice cracking like thin ice. Nathan's gaze hardened, unyielding as stone. "If you fail, it's not just your neck on the line. It's mine, it's Emily's. It's every innocent soul caught in Grayson's web. We all go down." The bar Lisa stepped into later that night was a grimy hole on the edge of town, its flickering neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness. The air inside was stale, thick with the stench of cheap beer and cigarette smoke that clung to the cracked leather booths. She'd dressed the part, worn jacket, ripped jeans, hair scraped into a messy bun, every detail screaming reckless broken cop. As she crossed the threshold, the room seemed to pause. Eyes darted her way, sizing her up from head to toe with suspicion and curiosity. She squared her shoulders, forcing a mask of calm over the storm raging inside her, and sauntered to the bar. "Whiskey," she called out, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She needed Victor's attention, but desperation was a luxury she couldn't afford. Settling onto a creaky stool, she let her words carry across the room, loud enough to hook her target. "Being a cop doesn't pay squat, does it? Too many rules, too little payoff. I'm ready to make some real cash." From the far corner, a figure shifted. Victor Steele lifted his head, his piercing gaze slicing through the dim light to lock onto her. Lisa felt it like a physical blow, his scrutiny peeling back her layers, searching for the lie beneath her bravado. Her heart thudded against her ribs, but she held her ground as he rose and approached, his boots thudding against the warped floorboards. "Who are you?" His voice was a low growl, edged with menace that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. She turned to face him, her expression a careful blend of defiance and indifference. "Harper," she said sharply. "Cop, ex-cop maybe, sick of the system. Word is, you're the guy who can help me out. Victor's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold promise of danger. You think I'd trust some stranger who strolls in here spinning a sob story? He sneered, leaning closer, his breath sour with whiskey. Lisa didn't flinch, meeting his stare head-on. I'm not asking for trust, she shot back, her tone firm as iron. I'm asking for a shot to prove myself. For a long, suffocating moment, Victor studied her, his eyes narrowing as if he could see straight through to her soul. The bar's chatter faded into a distant hum, the tension between them coiling tighter with every second. Finally, he straightened, jerking his head toward the door. Outside, he muttered. Lisa followed, her palms slick with sweat despite the biting chill of the night air that greeted them. As they walked, memories flooded her mind, snapshots of her rookie days when she'd been taught to judge by appearances, to distrust anyone who didn't fit the mold. Kids with weird hair are always trouble, an older cop had barked once, his voice dripping with cynicism. That poison had seeped into her, twisting her instincts until she'd seen Emily, a girl with uneven locks and quiet strength, as a threat instead of a victim. Maybe I've been wrong this whole time, she whispered to herself, the realization settling like a stone in her gut. Victor led her to a crumbling warehouse on the town's fringes, its rusted walls looming under the pale moonlight. Inside, a bare room held only a rickety table and 2 chairs, the air heavy with dust and decay. He sank into one seat, gesturing for her to take the other. You want in, he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Convince me. Lisa sat, her nerves buzzing like live wires, but she forced her hands to stay still. I'm a cop. Or was. The system's rotten, and I'm done playing by its rules. I can give you intel, investigation timelines, raid plans, whatever you need. All I want is a slice of the take. Victor's eyes bored into her, suspicion radiating off him in waves. Why should I believe you're not a plant? He pressed, leaning forward. Lisa inhaled deeply, steadying herself. If I were here to bust you, you'd already be in chains. I'm not begging for your faith. I'm offering a deal. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, until a smirk flickered across Victor's face. Fine, he said at last, his tone laced with warning. You get one chance. Cross us, and you'll wish you hadn't. Relief washed over Lisa, mingling with dread. She'd stepped into a viper's nest, balancing on a tightrope where one misstep meant ruin. But this wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption, about proving justice could still mean something, even if it came at a brutal cost. Meanwhile, in the Carter family's modest home, soft morning light spilled through the window, painting golden streaks across the scuffed wooden floor. Emily sat at the old piano in the corner, its chipped keys worn from years of use. Her fingers hovered above them, hesitant as she stared at the uneven strands of her hair reflected in a nearby mirror. Once, those jagged patches had been a wound she couldn't hide, a mark of shame carved into her by cruelty. Now they were something else, a quiet badge of survival. Beneath her calm exterior, though, the scars lingered, a storm of hurt and anger churning just out of sight. A blank sheet of music rested on the stand, its emptiness taunting her. With a shaky breath, she closed her eyes, letting the chaos in her mind spill into sound. Her fingers brushed the keys, coaxing out a melody that began low and mournful, a haunting echo of loss and betrayal. As she played, the notes shifted, climbing into brighter, defiant tones that sang of resilience, of a spirit refusing to break. Across the room, Nathan watched, his broad shoulders slumped with a mix of awe and grief. Emily wasn't just his daughter. She was a force, her music a lifeline pulling her from the depths. When the final note faded, she looked up, her eyes glistening but steady. They can take my hair, Dad, she said, her voice soft yet firm, but they can't take who I am. Nathan crossed the room, resting a calloused hand on her shoulder. I'm proud of you, Em, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. You're not just tough. You're showing me what real strength looks like. No one can shatter you unless you let them." She nodded, glancing back at the blank sheet. In that moment, she decided, she'd fill it with every note she'd just played, a permanent record of her fight, her pain, and her triumph. A few streets away, Lisa sat in her beat-up car, parked beneath the faint glow of a street lamp. The dim light cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the tension etched into her features. Every time she closed her eyes, Emily's defiant stare flashed behind her lids, the memory of that holding cell, the girl's quiet courage cutting through Lisa's assumptions like a knife. Guilt gnawed at her, a relentless ache that grew heavier with each passing day. She'd been wrong, horribly, unforgivably wrong, not just in her actions, but in the lens she'd used to view the world. Years on the force had warped her, turning her into a cynic who saw threats where there were none. She remembered her early days, a wide-eyed rookie eager to protect and serve, only to be molded by bitter veterans who sneered, "Kids like that? Never innocent. If they're not guilty now, they will be." That twisted logic had led her to Emily, to a mistake that now fueled her every move. This mission wasn't just about stopping Grayson, it was about proving that justice could still prevail, that power abused left scars, and that she could still claw her way back to the person she'd once wanted to be. The lessons Lisa had absorbed over time had rooted themselves deep within her, twisting her perception in ways she hadn't anticipated. Once, Emily had been just a girl to her, a quiet, unassuming presence. But now, standing near the Carter home, Lisa saw something else entirely. A potential threat, a shadow cast by her own guilt and missteps. Her regret gnawed at her, a relentless ache that made her chest feel tight as she climbed out of her car. Her legs wobbled beneath her, unsteady with the weight of what she'd done as she took hesitant steps toward the house. A golden glow poured from the living room window, soft and inviting, cutting through the cool night air. Through the glass, Lisa caught sight of Emily seated at the piano, her fingers dancing across the keys. Lisa stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat, unable to move closer. She stood there, a silent observer, as the music drifted out into the darkness, a haunting, powerful melody that wove together threads of sorrow and unshakable resilience. Each note seemed to reach inside Lisa, tugging at emotions she'd buried long ago, stirring a raw, unfamiliar ache in her soul. Emily's new composition was more than just sound. It was a mirror to her recent struggles, the jagged edges of pain softened by the quiet strength she'd found within herself. Lisa's throat constricted painfully as memories flooded back. The uneven, haphazard haircut she'd forced upon Emily meant to humiliate, and the girl's steady, defiant gaze that had refused to break. In that moment, watching Emily play, Lisa understood something profound. Emily wasn't merely a victim of circumstance. She was a beacon, a living testament to courage and recovery. That realization shifted something fundamental in Lisa. No longer could she approach her work with the cold, mechanical detachment of a police officer blindly following orders. A fire had ignited within her, a new purpose that went beyond the case files and protocol. She was determined to dismantle Grayson's sprawling network, not just for justice in the abstract, but for Emily, for herself, for the chance to right the wrongs she'd let fester. Every meeting with Victor Steele, Grayson's sharp-edged enforcer, plunged Lisa deeper into the underbelly of the operation. The danger was a constant, thrumming presence, palpable in the air like static before a storm. Yet Lisa stood firm, her resolve hardening with each step. At night, in the dim flicker of her apartment's lone lamp, she pored over her notebook, meticulously recording every detail, names, dates, snippets of overheard conversations. What began as a practical habit soon became a lifeline, a tangible thread tying her to the accountability she now craved. One evening, as the shadows stretched long across her cluttered living room, she scribbled a final line before snapping the notebook shut. Emily's resilience lights my path. If she can rise from the ashes of humiliation, I can climb out of the wreckage of my own mistakes. The words felt like a vow, a quiet promise to herself, Moved by that clarity, Lisa decided to do something tangible for Emily. She reached out to Nathan Carter, a man whose trust she'd once shattered, his voice still carrying the faint echo of wariness when they spoke. Together they arranged for Emily to visit the local music center, a modest building filled with the hum of creativity, where Emily often lost herself at the keys. There, Lisa left a secret gift, a sheet of music she'd composed herself, inspired by the melody that had floated through the Carter window that night. She'd spent hours hunched over her desk, pencil scratching against paper, translating the emotions Emily's playing had stirred in her, grief, defiance, hope, into a language of notes and rests. When Emily discovered the sheet music resting on the piano, her brow furrowed in curiosity. She sat down, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar lines before bringing them to life. As the first chords rang out, a flicker of recognition lit her eyes. The music seemed to echo her own heart, her pain, her resistance, her quiet forgiveness, each note a whisper from someone who understood. Emily didn't know who had penned it, but a gentle smile curved her lips as she played. To her, it was a gift of healing, a melody that spoke where words fell short. Watching Emily reclaim her strength piece by piece lifted a crushing weight from Lisa's shoulders. She could feel the road to redemption stretching out before her, long and treacherous, paved with the shards of her past. But she'd taken that first unsteady step, not just for Emily, but for herself. Her work as an officer was no longer a checklist of duties to tick off. It was a mission, a chance to prove she could change. She threw herself into rebuilding what she'd broken, mending the fragile trust with Nathan, earning back Emily's quiet respect, and honoring the community she'd once sworn to protect. The lessons of justice and the consequences of power loomed large in her mind, a constant reminder that authority unchecked could corrupt, could wound, could destroy. She wouldn't let that be her legacy. Meanwhile, night draped Grayson's warehouse in a heavy, suffocating darkness, the faint glow of industrial lights struggling to pierce the gloom. This was no ordinary building. It was the pulsing heart of a criminal empire, a sprawling web of drug trafficking, arms deals, and shadowy transactions that stretched far beyond the city's edges. Tonight, it would become a battleground, a stage for a confrontation thick with risk and sacrifice. In the FBI briefing room, Nathan Carter stood at the head of a worn wooden table, a detailed map of the warehouse unfurled before him. His team of agents leaned in, faces taut with focus, as he assigned roles with clipped precision. Lisa Harper lingered in the corner, her expression a mix of tension and fierce determination, her eyes alight with a fire that refused to dim. She knew her role in this raid was pivotal, not just to atone for her missteps, but to shield the people she'd once failed. Nathan's finger jabbed at a red circle marked on the map, his voice steady and commanding. Thanks to Harper's intel, we've confirmed Grayson will be here tonight. He's meeting with his partners to expand his network. This is our shot, one chance to take him down and rip this operation apart at the seams. The team nodded, their silence heavy with resolve. Lisa stepped forward, her voice cutting through the stillness with quiet strength. I'll go in first. I'll keep Victor Steele distracted and pinpoint Grayson's exact location. Nathan's gaze lingered on her, a storm of concern and trust swirling in his eyes. Harper, you sure about this? It's a powder keg in there, especially if Victor smells a rat. Lisa met his look without flinching, her nod firm. I've come too far to back down now. Nathan exhaled sharply, then turned to the team. We'll split into 3 groups. Harper signals, we strike. Be ready for anything. This isn't just a bust, it's a war. Dressed in plain, rugged clothes that blended into the warehouse's gritty chaos, Lisa stepped inside. She moved with a confidence born of familiarity, her senses sharp despite the tension crackling in the air. Men darted around her, checking crates and muttering in low, urgent tones. At the center of it all stood Victor Steele, his presence commanding, his sharp eyes sweeping the room like a predator on the hunt. When they landed on Lisa, a smirk tugged at his lips, though his stare remained icy and guarded. Harper, he called, his voice a low growl that carried weight. Right on time. We need a final check before this shipment rolls out. Lisa kept her cool, nodding as she approached, every muscle taut with the knowledge that a single slip could unravel everything. As she feigned interest in the goods, running her fingers along the edge of a crate, her other hand dipped into her pocket, activating the signal device concealed there. Outside, Nathan caught the faint buzz on his radio, his jaw tightening as he barked the order, "Move in, all angles, now!" The FBI teams surged forward, the warehouse's massive doors exploding inward with a deafening crash. Shouts pierced the air, "FBI, hands up!" as chaos erupted. Gunfire split the night, sharp and relentless, as agents clashed with Grayson's men. Lisa tried to hold Victor's attention, tossing out questions about the shipment's logistics, but his instincts were too honed. "What's your game, Harper?" he snarled, his hand darting to his waistband to draw a pistol. Lisa steadied herself, her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "Just doing my job, Victor." His eyes narrowed, realization dawning like a storm cloud breaking. He swung the gun toward her, but before he could fire, Nathan and his team burst through a side entrance. "Drop it, Victor!" Nathan roared. Victor whirled, aiming at Nathan instead. In that heartbeat, Lisa acted. Lunging forward, she shoved Nathan out of the bullet's path. The shot rang out, a thunderclap in the confined space, and Lisa crumpled, a searing pain blooming in her shoulder as blood soaked through her shirt. Nathan dropped to her side, his hands pressing against the wound, his voice tight with worry. "Hang on, Harper. You're gonna be okay." But his focus shifted as Victor bolted, disappearing into the warehouse's depths. "Team 2, with me!" Nathan shouted, leading the chase. They cornered Victor in a cramped room where Richard Grayson stood, frantically shredding papers, evidence of his empire slipping through his fingers. The air was thick with desperation, the consequences of unchecked power crashing down around them all. For Lisa, bleeding out on the cold concrete, it was a brutal lesson in justice. Redemption came at a cost, but it was a price she was willing to pay. Chaos erupted in the dimly lit warehouse, a sprawling battleground of splintered crates and flickering shadows, as Victor, cornered yet fiercely defiant, unleashed his fury. His muscles tensed, sweat dripping from his brow. He swung with the desperation of a man who knew this might be his last stand. Each punch he threw carried the weight of his resolve, a wild, untamed ferocity that roared through the stale air. But despite his relentless spirit, Nathan and his team closed in like a tightening noose. Their movements were sharp and coordinated, a symphony of force that overwhelmed Victor's raw strength. His resistance crumbled under their relentless pressure, leaving him breathless and subdued on the cold concrete floor, his chest heaving with the sting of defeat. Meanwhile, across the warehouse, another scene unfolded with chilling precision. Grayson, a man whose icy demeanor could freeze the room, found himself ensnared by a different agent. The metallic clink of handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed faintly, a sound that might have humbled most, but not him. As the steel bit into his skin, he tilted his head slightly, a smirk curling his lips, a predator's grin, unshaken by captivity. "You really think locking me up changes a damn thing?" he sneered, his voice low and venomous, dripping with arrogance. "I've got eyes and hands everywhere, threads you'll never untangle." Nathan, standing just a few feet away, didn't waver. His jaw tightened, and his piercing gaze met Grayson's without a flicker of fear. "We'll deal with your web later," he shot back, his tone as hard as iron. "For now, keep your mouth shut." The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, a silent vow that this was far from over. With the warehouse secured, Nathan's focus shifted, his boots pounding against the floor as he raced back to where Lisa Harper lay sprawled in a pool of her own blood. The sight hit him like a sledgehammer. Her shirt, once crisp and white, now clung to her, saturated crimson, a stark contrast to the pallor of her face. Yet her eyes, wide open and glinting with an unyielding fire, told a different story. She was still in the fight, clinging to life with every ounce of her being. Nathan dropped to his knees beside her, his voice breaking as it escaped his throat. "Harper, are you okay?" The words trembled, raw with fear and desperation, betraying the stoic mask he usually wore. Lisa's lips curved into a faint, fragile smile, her breath shallow but steady. "I promised myself no more failures," she whispered, her voice a threadbare whisper of triumph. "I did it, didn't I?" Nathan's hand found hers, gripping it tightly as if he could anchor her to the world through sheer will. "You've done more than anyone could have dreamed, Harper," he said, his voice thick with emotion, a swell of pride and gratitude rising in his chest. "You saved me. You saved the mission." Her weak nod was all she could manage before the distant wail of sirens grew louder, and soon paramedics swarmed the scene, lifting her onto a stretcher with practiced urgency. Nathan stood back, watching as the ambulance doors slammed shut, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and reverence for the woman who'd risked everything. Days later, sunlight streamed through the sterile white curtains of a hospital room, casting soft patterns on the tiled floor where Lisa awoke. Her body ached, a dull reminder of the battle she'd endured, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in years. Blinking against the brightness, she turned her head and saw Nathan and Emily Carter standing by her bedside. Nathan's face was etched with quiet strength, his eyes warm with unspoken thanks. Beside him, Emily, a young woman whose presence radiated a gentle resilience, looked at Lisa with something new. Kindness, unguarded and sincere, a far cry from the wary distance she'd once kept. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice soft but firm, each word deliberate. "You saved my dad. You showed me people can change." Lisa's lips trembled into a weak but genuine smile. "No, Emily," she murmured. "You changed me. Your strength, it's something I'll carry with me forever." Nathan rested a hand on Lisa's shoulder, his touch steady and reassuring. "Harper, you've redeemed yourself in ways no one could deny," he said, his voice low and earnest. "You've saved lives, including your own." A single tear slipped down Lisa's cheek, warm against her skin, as a flood of realization washed over her. After years of guilt and missteps, this painful journey had finally led her back to the person she'd once hoped to be. The next morning, a golden dawn spilled through the window of the small police station room where Lisa packed the remnants of her old life. Each item she touched stirred a storm of memories. A badge, its edges worn from years of service, once a shining symbol of her ideals, now tarnished by her own failings. A notebook, its pages yellowed and filled with the scribbled dreams of her rookie days. A faded team photo, the faces of colleagues she'd once called family staring back at her. Her fingers lingered on the frame, a pang of nostalgia twisting in her gut, but she knew it was time to let go. Not just to atone for the shadows of her past, but to step into a future unshackled by them. With her belongings boxed, she crossed the hall to Captain Monroe's office, her resignation letter clutched in her hand. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old leather, a comforting familiarity that made her decision bittersweet. She placed the letter on his desk, her expression resolute yet softened by a flicker of regret. Monroe, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a voice that carried the weight of decades on the force, picked it up and read it slowly, his brow furrowing. "You sure about this, Harper?" he asked, his tone grave but laced with respect. "You just pulled yourself out of a hell of a mess. The team could use someone like you, someone who's seen the cracks in this system and knows how to fix them." Lisa shook her head, a small, wistful smile tugging at her lips. "I've wrestled with this, Captain," she said softly. "This job taught me everything, good and bad, but I can't stay. I need to step away from the biases it built in me, start over, and help the people I've wronged." Monroe leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment, then set the letter down with a nod. "I respect that, Harper," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "What you did out there showed guts and a heart for real change. Don't lose that." As she walked out, a weight lifted from her shoulders, replaced by a quiet determination to forge a new path. Not as a cop, but as a woman seeking redemption through service. Meanwhile, Emily Carter's star continued to rise, her music echoing through grand concert halls and beyond. After a breathtaking performance, her name rippled through crowds and headlines, a beacon of hope for those who knew her story. A young woman who'd turned pain into power. At every show, she didn't just play notes. She bared her soul, weaving tales of struggle and triumph into every chord. "Music is my healing," she said in an interview, her voice steady and bright. "I hope it helps others find their own strength." At one unforgettable concert, she debuted a new piece, its opening notes soft yet commanding, tracing her path from despair to forgiveness. As the final note lingered in the air, the audience sat spellbound, then exploded into applause that shook the rafters. In the front row, Nathan watched, his eyes glistening with pride. His daughter hadn't just survived. She'd transformed her wounds into something radiant, a gift that lifted everyone around her. One quiet afternoon, Emily returned home to find an envelope waiting on her table, her name scrawled in careful, deliberate handwriting. Inside was a letter from Lisa Harper, its words heavy with remorse and hope. "Emily," it began, "I know apologies can't erase the past, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I judged you unfairly, let my own flaws guide me, and hurt you in ways you never deserved. There's no excuse for that. But you changed me. Your courage forced me to face the parts of myself I'd buried. You taught me strength isn't power, it's compassion, forgiveness. I've left the force to start anew, working in the community to make amends. Thank you for not letting me break you. You've made me want to be better. Wishing you all the success and joy you deserve, Lisa." Emily folded the letter and set it on her piano, staring at it as emotions swirled within her, relief, gratitude, and a quiet closure. The past couldn't be unwritten, but its grip on her loosened just a little. Weeks later, at a bustling community center, Lisa led a workshop for teenagers, their faces marked by the same struggles Emily had once known: judgment, labels, pain. She listened to their stories, her own past a mirror to theirs, and shared how she'd stumbled, fallen, and risen again, hoping to spark a flicker of belief in them. As the session wound down, she glanced up and froze. Emily stood in the doorway, her presence unexpected yet calm. Lisa's heart thudded, but she steadied herself. When the room emptied, Emily approached, her smile faint but warm. "Thank you for the letter," she said simply. "I don't hate you. I'm glad you've changed." Lisa's throat tightened, words catching as she replied, "Emily, thank you. You've given me a chance to make this right. I won't forget it." For a moment, they stood in a silence that wasn't cold or distant, but shared, a bridge between two souls who'd turned scars into lessons. Emily's music soared on, inspiring thousands, while Lisa poured herself into her work, each step a testament to the justice and consequences of power misused and the redemption that could follow. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden warmth across the city streets, painting the world in hues of amber and rose. The tranquil glow seemed to settle over everything, softening the edges of a bustling day and ushering in the promise of an unforgettable evening. At the heart of it all stood the grand concert hall, its towering arches and gleaming facade a beacon for the hundreds of attendees streaming through its doors. They had come for Emily Carter's long-awaited performance, a night that had been whispered about for months. For Emily, this wasn't merely a chance to display her musical prowess, it was a stage to unveil her soul, to weave a tapestry of resilience that had lifted her from the ashes of her past and touched the lives of so many others. In the shadowed farthest corner of the auditorium, Lisa Harper slipped into a seat, her movements deliberate and quiet. She chose a spot tucked away from the dazzling lights and curious eyes, a place where she could blend into the crowd unnoticed. Her presence here wasn't about reclaiming some lost piece of herself or begging for absolution. No, it was simpler than that. She was here to bear witness, to see Emily rise, to watch her triumph over the jagged scars of adversity that Lisa herself had once helped carve. As the audience settled into their seats, the hum of anticipation dissolved into a reverent hush. Lisa's chest tightened, her pulse quickening as her gaze drifted toward the stage. She couldn't help but feel a storm of emotions churning within her: pride, guilt, and something softer, like awe. She thought of the young woman she had once wronged, a girl who had somehow emerged from the wreckage stronger, brighter, and more whole than Lisa could have ever imagined. The stage lights flared to life, cutting through the dimness like a spotlight on hope itself. Emily stepped forward, her elegant white dress shimmering faintly under the glow. Each step she took was a study in grace, her shoulders squared with quiet confidence, her presence commanding the space without effort. She was no longer the fragile soul Lisa remembered. She was an artist, a force, a woman who had wrested control of her destiny from the hands of those who had tried to break her. Lisa's eyes locked onto her, unable to look away, captivated by the transformation unfolding before her. This wasn't just Emily anymore. This was a beacon, a living testament to what it meant to endure and rise again. Emily settled at the piano, her fingers hovering above the keys for a fleeting moment, as if gathering the courage to pour her heart into the world. Her gaze swept across the sea of faces, a ripple of connection passing between her and the audience. Then, for the briefest second, her eyes found Lisa's. Lisa froze, her breath snagging in her throat, a flicker of panic tightening her grip on the armrest. But Emily didn't flinch or turn away. Instead, she offered the small, serene nod, a gesture so subtle yet so profound that it pierced through the years of pain between them. In that quiet exchange, Lisa saw no trace of the anger or bitterness she might have expected. There was only forgiveness, a calm acceptance that spoke louder than words ever could. It was a silent promise. The past was no longer a chain binding them. They had both stepped into the light of something new. The first notes of Emily's performance rang out, delicate and tender, like the patter of rain on a still morning. The audience leaned in, entranced, as she transitioned into her opening piece. When it concluded, she rose from the piano and approached the microphone, her posture steady despite the weight of the moment. The crowd held its breath, every eye fixed on her. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice clear and resonant, threaded with a vulnerability that made it all the more powerful. "I want to share something with you, a story, my story. It's about the journey I've walked and the truths I've uncovered along the way." She paused, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, but her chin lifted with resolve. "Life hands us pain sometimes, the kind that feels too heavy to bear. But I've learned that real strength isn't about dodging that pain or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about facing it head-on, picking up the pieces, and building something new from what's left." The room was utterly still, every word sinking into the hearts of those listening. For Lisa, it was as if Emily's voice reached inside her, stirring the guilt and regret she'd carried for so long. Yet there was something else, too, a flicker of recognition. Emily's story wasn't just her own. It echoed Lisa's as well, a mirror reflecting their shared struggles and the quiet victories they'd each fought for. "Music became my lifeline," Emily continued, her tone softening with gratitude. "It showed me the strength I didn't know I had, and I hope, through my story, you'll see that no matter what shadows fall across your path, you can stand up, dust yourself off, and keep going." When she finished speaking, the hall erupted into applause, a wave of sound that crashed over the room like a tide. Lisa clapped too, her hands trembling as tears slipped down her cheeks, warm and unbidden. The ovation wasn't just for Emily's talent, it was for her bravery, her willingness to forgive, and the unyielding spirit she'd forged through years of trial. Emily returned to the piano, her fingers finding the keys once more as she launched into her newest composition, Resilience. The melody began softly, a gentle cascade of notes that felt like whispers of healing. But as it built, it swelled into something grander, a powerful surge of sound that told a story all its own, a journey through despair, determination, and finally, triumph. Lisa closed her eyes, letting the music envelop her. Each chord seemed to trace the contours of Emily's life, but it resonated with her own too. A reminder of mistakes she'd made, the growth she'd clawed her way toward, and the fragile hope she now cradled in her hands. The song was a quiet vow. No matter how deep the darkness, light could always be found. As the final note lingered in the air, the audience sat in stunned silence, reluctant to shatter the sacred stillness. Then, like a dam breaking, applause thundered through the hall once more, a roaring tribute to Emily's artistry and her soul. Lisa smiled through her tears, brushing away the last traces of moisture on her face. She saw it clearly now. Emily had transcended her pain, not just the personal wounds she'd borne, but the crushing weight of everyone's expectations. She had become something greater, a symbol of what justice and redemption could look like when wielded with grace. The concert drew to a close, and Lisa made no move to approach Emily. She didn't need to. Instead, she slipped out of the auditorium as quietly as she'd arrived, leaving the spotlight where it belonged. On Emily, basking in a triumph she'd earned every inch of. As Lisa walked home through the cool night air, a profound relief settled over her, a sensation so foreign it took her a moment to name it. She didn't need words to know Emily had forgiven her. That forgiveness had been woven into the music, etched into the nod they'd shared, a quiet absolution that lifted a burden Lisa hadn't realized she'd been carrying for so long. The next morning, the soft glow of dawn filtered through the windows of the community center, bathing the modest space in a peaceful light. Lisa Harper moved through the room with purpose, her simple sweater and jeans a far cry from the crisp uniform she'd once worn as a police officer. She arranged chairs in a loose circle and set out a tray of coffee and pastries, her hands steady in the familiar rhythm of her new life. The center had become her sanctuary, a place where she poured her energy into mentoring teenagers who'd faced the same prejudice and hardship she'd once enforced. Each day here was a step toward redemption, a chance to listen to the kids' stories, some halting and shy, others spilling out in bursts of frustration, and offer them the support she wished she'd had when she was younger. There was Jamal, a wiry boy with a quick laugh who hid his fear of failure behind bravado. Maria, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, and whose quiet anger simmered just below the surface. And Nathan, a lanky teen with a poet's soul who'd seen too much loss for his 16 years. They were her purpose now, and through them she was learning as much as she was teaching. That morning she led a group discussion, her voice steady as she opened up about her own past. "I made mistakes," she said, meeting their eyes without flinching. "I hurt people because I thought I was doing my job, keeping order. But I was wrong. And it took losing everything, my badge, my pride, to see that power isn't justice if it's built on someone else's pain." The room was quiet, the kids leaning in, their usual restlessness replaced by something deeper. "What I've learned," she went on, "is that it's never too late to change. You can stumble, fall, even break, but you can still get up and make it right." Her honesty struck a chord, and for the first time Maria softened, her guarded expression giving way to a tentative nod. Nathan scribbled something in his notebook, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Lisa felt a warmth bloom in her chest. This was her amends, her way of turning the wreckage of her past into something meaningful. Weeks later, their stories, Emily's and Lisa's, found new life in a short documentary crafted by a local nonprofit. The film traced Emily's ascent from a victim of bias to a radiant symbol of hope, her music a thread that stitched her wounds into something beautiful. Alongside it ran Lisa's arc, from a flawed enforcer of those same injustices to a mentor who'd traded her authority for compassion. The documentary didn't shy away from the messy truth, Lisa's abuse of power, the pain it had caused Emily, the slow unraveling of their lives before they found their footing again. When it aired, it spread like wildfire, tugging at heartstrings across the country. Emily received stacks of letters from young people, their shaky handwriting thanking her for showing them they could rise above their struggles. Lisa, too, noticed more teens trickling into the community center, their eyes curious and searching, drawn by the story of a woman who'd fallen and fought her way back. One afternoon, as Lisa oversaw a mural project at the center, Emily's resilience drifted through the speakers, its familiar notes wrapping around the room like a warm embrace. She paused, paintbrush in hand, to take in the nearly finished artwork. The mural blazed with color, a phoenix soaring from a bed of ashes, its wings spread wide, the words, "Resilience is strength," curling beneath it in bold, looping script. The kids had poured themselves into it, each brushstroke a piece of their own stories. Jamal had insisted on the fiery reds, a reflection of his restless energy. Maria had layered in deep blues, her steady hand channeling her quiet intensity. Nathan had added the soft golds, a nod to the hope he was beginning to let himself feel. Lisa's lips curved into a smile, wide and unguarded. She and Emily were bound together, not to erase what had been, but to transform it into something enduring and beautiful. A lesson in justice, in the consequences of power misused, and in the quiet, persistent strength of forgiveness. The air was thick with skepticism when Lisa first stepped into the community center, a place buzzing with the restless energy of teenagers who had learned to guard their hearts against the world. She could feel their wary glances like pinpricks on her skin, their distrust a heavy fog she didn't try to dispel with empty words. Lisa knew all too well why they kept her at arm's length. She'd once been someone who judged too quickly, her old beliefs sharp-edged and cruel, cutting wounds she now ached to mend. So instead of forcing her way in, she let her presence speak for itself, her quiet sincerity a slow drip wearing down stone. One humid afternoon, as she guided a cluster of kids painting a mural across a weathered wall, a boy named Jaden lingered at the edge of the group. His thin frame hunched slightly, his dark eyes flickering with hesitation as he clutched a paintbrush like it might betray him. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Harper, why are you even here? You're not like the rest of them." Lisa set her own brush down, turning to him with a smile that carried the weight of her regret. "I'm here because I messed up, Jaden," she said, her tone soft but unflinching. "I used to see people through a warped lens, and it hurt them. Hurt me too, in the end. But I've learned that if you really want to, you can change. I'm trying to prove that, one day at a time." Jaden didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, his guarded expression cracking ever so slightly, like sunlight slipping through a shutter. In that fleeting moment, Lisa glimpsed the first fragile thread of trust weaving between them, a victory so small it could fit in her palm, yet it felt monumental. Across the center, in a room where sunlight streamed through cracked windows, the warm notes of a piano floated through the air. Emily Carter sat at the keys, her fingers coaxing life from the worn instrument as a gaggle of children clustered around her. She'd only recently started volunteering, nudged by Lisa's gentle suggestion that music might unlock something in these kids that words alone couldn't reach. For Emily, teaching wasn't just about scales or chords. It was about showing them they could rise above the chaos life had dealt them. That hope could take root even in the hardest ground. One day, as the group chattered and stumbled through their lessons, Emily's gaze landed on a girl named Lila, barely 10, tucked into a corner like a shadow trying to vanish. Her small hands twisted in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. Emily approached her slowly, kneeling so their faces were level. "Lila, would you like to give it a try?" she asked, her voice a soft invitation. Lila shook her head, her braids swaying faintly. "I'm no good at it," she mumbled. "They'll laugh." Emily's heart ached at the fear in her words, a fear she'd once known too well. "I used to think I'd never be good enough to play for anyone," she confessed, her smile tinged with memory. "But then I figured out it's not about what they think. It's about how the music makes you feel." Sitting beside Lila, Emily let her fingers drift over the keys, weaving a melody that seemed to wrap the room in warmth. After a long pause, Lila's trembling hands crept toward the piano, tapping out a few uncertain notes. Emily beamed at her, a quiet encouragement, and in that tender exchange, Lila's hunched shoulders lifted just a little, as if she'd caught a glimpse of her own worth. As weeks turned to months, Lisa and Emily found their paths intertwining more and more, their efforts at the center blending into something greater than either could have foreseen. Emily led her piano classes with a steady grace, while Lisa hovered nearby, ready to listen when a child's frustrations spilled over or their dreams flickered to life. One crisp afternoon, as they prepared for a modest recital, little more than a handful of folding chairs and a makeshift stage, Lisa paused, her hands full of crumpled programs. She turned to Emily, her voice catching slightly. "I don't know how to thank you, Emily. If you hadn't stuck with me, I'd still be lost." Emily met her eyes, her own gaze steady and kind. "Miss Harper, we're both just doing what we can. The real trick is not giving up." Her words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Lisa's chest. Once, a vast chasm had yawned between them. Lisa, the repentant outsider, Emily, the reluctant ally. But now they stood shoulder to shoulder, united in a quiet mission to lift up the kids around them. That evening, as the children took the stage, their small hands trembling over keys or brushes, the room filled with the hum of a community pulling together. Emily played alongside them, her presence a steady anchor, while Lisa lingered at the back, her cheers a fierce whisper of pride for each child who dared to shine. When the final note faded and applause roared through the space, Lisa and Emily locked eyes across the crowd, a shared smile sealing their unspoken bond. What had started as a tangle of guilt and mistrust had grown into something radiant, a testament to second chances, to the slow, stubborn work of healing. The community center transformed into a lighthouse of sorts, its glow reaching beyond the chipped paint and sagging roof to touch the neighborhood around it. Whispers of Lisa and Emily's journey spread like wildfire, sparking quiet conversations in coffee shops and on stoops, talk of forgiveness, of growth, of what it meant to own your mistakes and build something better. Lisa wasn't just a woman clawing her way toward redemption anymore. She'd become a compass for the teens she mentored, pointing them toward futures they hadn't dared imagine. Emily, with her artist's soul and teacher's patience, didn't just share music, she sowed seeds of courage, showing every child that obstacles weren't walls but stepping stones. Together they knew they couldn't rewrite the world's injustices, but they could shift the ground beneath their feet, one life at a time. Their story wasn't a fairy tale of perfection. It was raw, real, a mosaic of pain turned to purpose. The center stood as living proof that even the ugliest scars could birth something beautiful, a lesson in justice not as punishment, but as restoration. A warning that power misused leaves wreckage, while power shared builds bridges. Meanwhile, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, Officer James Miller slouched in his patrol car, the bitter dregs of cold coffee staining his cup from the diner down the road. His eyes, narrowed to slits, tracked the lazy flow of traffic along Oak Street, a thoroughfare stitching the suburbs to the city's medical district. After 15 years on the force, he prided himself on his instincts, a word he clung to, though others might call it something darker, a bias honed to a razor's edge. The dashboard clock blinked 2:45 p.m. when a sleek black Mercedes rolled into view, its polished frame glinting under the overcast sky. Behind the wheel sat a young black woman, her twin beside her in the passenger seat, both clad in medical scrubs peeking out from under their coats. Miller's jaw clenched, a storm brewing in his gut. "Too nice a car for this area," he muttered, ignoring the sprawling million-dollar homes just a stone's throw away. Without a second thought, he eased his cruiser into traffic, ran the plates, and flicked on his lights. The Mercedes signaled promptly, pulling over with textbook precision, the driver's hands resting visibly on the wheel. Miller's suspicion only deepened. She'd done this before, he thought, his boots crunching gravel as he swaggered toward the car. He took his time approaching, letting the seconds stretch, noting the hospital ID badges dangling from the rearview mirror, but dismissing them with a flick of his eyes. The driver's window hummed down, and he barked, "License and registration," skipping any pretense of courtesy. "Of course, officer," the driver replied, her voice calm as still water. "I'm Dr. Sarah Carter, and this is my sister, Dr. Rachel Carter. We're trauma surgeons at City General on our way to—" Miller cut her off, his tone sharp as a blade. "Did I ask for your biography, license, and registration?" The sisters exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. Sarah reached for her purse with deliberate care, while Rachel kept her hands in plain sight, her posture rigid but composed. They'd danced this dance before, their movements a choreography born of necessity. As Sarah handed over the documents, Rachel spoke, her voice firm yet measured. "Officer, we need to explain. We've been called in for an emergency surgery. There's been a major accident and—" Miller's hand dropped to his belt, a silent threat. "One more word, ma'am, and we've got a problem. Your sister can tell it to the judge. 58 in a 45 zone." It was a lie, spun from thin air. They'd been dead on the speed limit, but Miller had a knack for conjuring violations where none existed. He sauntered back to his car, dragging out the paperwork, his gaze flicking to the rearview mirror where the twins sat motionless, hands still, faces forward. His radio crackled, urgent. "All units near City General, incoming trauma case, multiple vehicles, all medical personnel needed." Miller tuned it out, scribbling nonsense on his clipboard, the weight of his badge a shield for every choice he made. In the stark contrast of these lives, Lisa and Emily weaving hope from broken threads, Miller wielding power like a blunt instrument, lay a deeper truth. Justice isn't just a gavel's strike. It's the slow unraveling of harm, the accountability of those who abuse their place. Miller's actions rippled outward, delaying lives that hung in the balance, while Lisa and Emily's stitched a fractured community together. Their stories, braided together, whispered a lesson. Power unchecked breeds chaos, but power tempered with mercy can light the way home. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt of the quiet suburban road where Officer James Miller sat in his patrol car, scribbling out a traffic ticket with deliberate, almost torturous slowness. His pen scratched against the paper as he glanced up through the windshield at the sleek Mercedes ahead, where the Carter twins sat in tense silence. Sarah and Rachel Carter, both in their mid-30s with sharp features softened only by exhaustion, fidgeted with their phones. Their faces, illuminated by the bluish glow of their screens, tightened with every passing second, brows furrowing deeper as notifications pinged relentlessly. Yet they said nothing, their lips pressed into thin lines, their cooperation unshaken despite the mounting unease Miller could sense radiating from them. He adjusted his grip on the ticket pad, savoring the petty authority of the moment, when a sharp trill cut through the hum of his idling engine. His personal phone vibrated against the dashboard, displaying an unknown number. A flicker of instinct, or perhaps dread, urged him to pick it up, despite the protocol nagging at the back of his mind. "Hello?" he answered, his voice gruff, steadying himself for some mundane annoyance. "Is this Officer James Miller?" came a clipped, urgent voice on the other end. "Yes, who's this?" he replied, impatience creeping in. "Sir, this is Nurse Martinez from City General Emergency Department. Your daughter Emma was just brought in. She's been in a multi-car pileup on Highway 27. Her condition's critical. We need your immediate authorization for emergency surgery." The world lurched. Miller's breath caught in his chest, his hand trembling so violently the phone nearly slipped from his grasp. Emma, his Emma, 16 years old, with her bright laugh and cheerleader's spirit, was at school just hours ago, waving goodbye with her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Sir, you need to get here now," the nurse pressed, her voice a lifeline pulling him back from the edge of shock. "The trauma team's assembling, but we need your consent." Her words blurred into static as his gaze snapped forward, locking onto the Mercedes. The twins were hunched over their phones now, their heads bent close, whispering fiercely to each other. Something clicked in Miller's reeling mind as he fumbled with the documents they'd handed him earlier, his fingers clumsy with panic. He forced himself to focus, to really look this time. Dr. Sarah Carter, Dr. Rachel Carter, Chief Residence, Trauma Surgery, City General Hospital. The same hospital where Emma lay broken and bleeding, the same doctors now being summoned to save her life, the same women he'd detained over nothing more than a hunch, a flicker of bias he hadn't even questioned until this moment. His throat constricted, a dry, bitter taste flooding his mouth as the enormity of his mistake crashed over him like a tidal wave. He'd wasted their time, minutes that might mean the difference between life and death for his own child, all because he'd let suspicion cloud his judgment. Legs unsteady, Miller stumbled out of his patrol car, the ticket forgotten on the seat. The cool evening air bit at his sweat-dampened skin as he approached the Mercedes again, his once authoritative stride reduced to a shaky shuffle. The twins looked up, their guarded eyes meeting his, and before he could muster a word, Dr. Sarah Carter thrust her phone toward him. "Officer, we just got a trauma alert," she said, her tone clipped but professional, betraying none of the frustration she must have felt. "Multiple casualties from a highway crash, a teenage girl's critical. We're the on-call surgeons, and every minute counts." "That's my daughter," Miller blurted, his voice fracturing into a raw, desperate plea. "Emma Miller, she's 16. Please, I just got the call." The twins' expressions shifted in an instant, from wary restraint to razor-sharp focus. Dr. Rachel Carter was already dialing the hospital, her voice steady as she barked orders into the receiver. "This is Dr. Rachel Carter. We're en route, delayed by a traffic stop. Tell the OR team to start prep. Get Dr. Matthews on initial assessment. Doctor." Sarah turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life as Rachel fixed Miller with a resolute stare. "Officer, we need to move. Will you escort us?" He nodded, mute and hollow, sprinting back to his cruiser. His hands shook so badly he fumbled the keys twice before jamming them into the ignition. Sirens blared to life as he peeled out behind the Mercedes, tires squealing against the pavement. The 5-minute drive to City General stretched into an eternity, his mind a storm of guilt and terror. Through the windshield, he glimpsed the twins' silhouettes, their heads bent over a speakerphone as they coordinated with their team, voices calm and commanding despite the chaos. If he hadn't stopped them, if he hadn't let his baseless assumptions dictate his actions, they'd already be there, scrubbed in, fighting for Emma. Every red light they sped through, every honk of a displaced car was a reminder of the time he'd stolen. They screeched into the hospital's emergency bay, tires skidding as staff swarmed the entrance. The twins leapt out, Dr. Sarah tossing her keys to an orderly with a flick of her wrist, while Dr. Rachel yanked a surgical cap from her bag. "Officer Miller, follow us!" Sarah called over her shoulder, her voice cutting through the clamor as they charged inside. He trailed them, his heavy boots clashing with the sterile tiles, feeling like an intruder amid the flurry of scrubs and gurneys. They burst into the trauma bay, and Miller's heart seized at the sight of Emma, his little girl, sprawled on a stretcher, her face a map of cuts and bruises, her cheerleading uniform drenched crimson. Machines shrieked around her, a nurse shouting, "BP's 80/40 and dropping. Get her to OR3 now." Dr. Rachel took charge, her voice a lifeline in the chaos. "Prep 2 units of ONEG, stat." Dr. Sarah turned to Miller, her eyes steady despite the storm around them. "Officer, we need your consent for surgery. Emma's got internal bleeding and possible head trauma. Every second matters. Do we have your permission?" His nod was frantic, almost involuntary, as he scrawled his signature on the forms a nurse shoved into his hands. He stood frozen as they wheeled Emma away, the twins jogging beside the gurney, their voices rising over the din. "Type and cross for 6 units, CT on standby. Tell anesthesia we're inbound." At the OR doors, Dr. Sarah paused, turning to him. The woman he'd sneered at minutes ago was gone, replaced by a surgeon radiating quiet confidence. "Officer Miller, we'll do everything we can for Emma. The waiting room's down that hall. Someone will keep you updated." Her gaze held his, unflinching. "Despite what happened earlier, your daughter's getting our best. That's who we are." Then she vanished through the doors, leaving him alone in the sterile corridor, the weight of his uniform suffocating him. A soft-spoken nurse guided him to the waiting room where he collapsed into a hard plastic chair. The clock's relentless ticking filled the silence, each second a hammer against his skull. He replayed the traffic stop in his mind, The way he'd eyed the twins with disdain, the clipped tone he'd used, the power he'd wielded without a second thought. Now, those same hands he'd delayed held Emma's life in their grasp. Justice, he realized, wasn't just in the badge he wore. It was in the consequences of his choices, the lives he'd brushed against with his arrogance. 2 hours dragged by, each minute an eternity. Miller shed his jacket, pacing the polished floor until his boots squeaked in protest. His badge felt like a lead weight pinned to his chest. Every time the OR doors swung open, his pulse spiked, only to crash when it wasn't about Emma. He watched other families, some sobbing with joy, others crumbling in despair, and envied their resolution while he remained suspended in limbo. Finally, Dr. Rachel emerged, her surgical cap still perched atop her dark hair, though she'd swapped her blood-stained scrubs for fresh ones. Miller lunged forward, his voice hoarse. "Emma?" She met his gaze, her tone measured but warm. "She's stable for now. Sarah's finishing the main surgery, but I wanted to update you myself. She had severe internal bleeding. The airbag saved her, but her spleen's ruptured. We're removing it. There's brain swelling, too, which we're watching closely." He sagged against the wall, knees buckling. "But she'll live?" he rasped. "We're doing everything we can," Rachel replied, choosing her words with care. "The next few hours are critical. Sarah's the best surgeon I know, and not just because she's my twin." A faint, weary smile tugged at her lips. "Emma's young, strong. That's on her side." Shame burned through him as he stared at the floor. "Dr. Carter, about earlier, I need to apologize. The way I treated you both." She raised a hand, silencing him. "Officer Miller, right now our focus is Emma. We'll talk later." Her pager buzzed and her face tightened as she glanced at it. "I've got to get back. Someone will update you soon." She hesitated, then added, "If you want, you can watch from the gallery. Seeing her being cared for might help, even if it's hard." He nodded, gratitude choking his words, and followed a nurse to the observation room. Through the wide glass, he peered into OR3. Dr. Sarah Carter stood at the table, her gloved hands moving with surgical precision under blinding lights, surrounded by a team in synchronized motion. Emma lay still beneath the sterile drapes, a fragile figure amid the gleaming instruments. Miller pressed a hand to the glass, his breath fogging the surface, and whispered a prayer, not just for his daughter, but for forgiveness from the women he'd wronged, whose skill now held his world together. In that moment, he understood the true depth of justice, not in wielding power, but in facing its repercussions. The glowing monitors cast a sterile light across the room, displaying the fragile rhythm of Emma's vital signs. Her heartbeat pulsing faintly, her oxygen levels teetering like a tightrope walker on the edge. Nurses glided through the space with a quiet efficiency, their footsteps muffled against the linoleum floor, their hands already reaching for instruments and gauze pads before the surgeons could even form the words. Every movement was deliberate, a silent dance born from years of anticipating the unspoken. Dr. Rachel Carter burst back into the operating theater, her scrubs still damp from the hurried scrub-in, her breath steady but quick as she rejoined her twin sister, Dr. Sarah, at the table. The air hummed with tension, a symphony of beeps and hushed voices, as the sisters bent over Emma's still form, their hands moving in unison like extensions of a single mind. From his perch in the observation room above, Officer Miller watched, his chest tight with a mixture of awe and dread. The twins worked in perfect harmony, their communication reduced to subtle glances and the faintest tilts of their heads. No words needed, no wasted motion. Their fingers danced with a precision that seemed almost otherworldly, threading sutures through delicate tissue, adjusting clamps with the care of sculptors shaping clay. Miller's eyes, sharpened by years on the force, caught details he'd overlooked in the chaos of earlier hours. The way Sarah's brow furrowed into deep creases when Emma's blood pressure faltered, a silent map of her worry etched across her skin. The way Rachel's gaze never wavered, even as she swiped a sleeve across her sweat-drenched forehead, her focus a fortress against the mounting strain. And then there was the tenderness, the way their hands cradled Emma's unconscious body as if she were a fragile treasure, a child they'd sworn to protect. These were the same women he'd dismissed with a sneer just hours ago, the same women he'd pegged as liars, as nobodies, unworthy of respect. The memory hit him like a fist to the gut. Earlier that day, he'd pulled them over, his flashlight cutting through the dusk as it swept across their car. Sarah's hands had rested carefully on the steering wheel, her posture rigid but calm, while Rachel kept her movements slow and measured beside her. At the time, he'd thought they were just following protocol, playing it safe under the weight of his badge. Now, he saw it for what it was. Survival. How many times had they faced this? How many officers like him had sized them up, two black women in a decent car, and decided they didn't belong, couldn't possibly be who they said they were? He'd scoffed when they'd explained their rush to the hospital, their voices steady as they mentioned an emergency surgery. Doctors? Them? He'd almost laughed, his assumptions hardening into a wall of arrogance. Yet here they were, pouring every ounce of their skill into saving his daughter's life, their hands steady where his trembled. Below, an alarm erupted, its shrill cry slicing through the room like a blade. Miller pressed himself against the glass, his breath fogging the pain as the surgical team sprang into action. Sarah's voice rang out, clear and unshaken, issuing commands with the authority of a general on a battlefield, while Rachel's hands darted to the source of the crisis, her movements a blur of controlled urgency. Miller's heart pounded against his ribs, a wild, helpless thing. All his years wielding a badge, barking orders, and commanding respect meant nothing here. He couldn't shield Emma from this. He couldn't storm in and demand her safety. All he could do was stand there, a powerless spectator, pinning his hopes on the two women he'd wronged. The observation room dimmed as evening draped itself over the hospital, shadows stretching across the walls, but Miller barely registered the change. His world had shrunk to the scene below, where the Carter twins battled on, their scrubs stained with sweat and determination. Another crisis flared. Emma's blood pressure plummeted, the monitors screaming in protest. "She's hemorrhaging!" a nurse shouted, her voice taut with panic. Sarah's tone remained even as she directed Rachel to take her place, her own hands diving into the surgical field to trace the source of the bleeding. Red bloomed across the table, pooling faster than the suction could whisk it away, and Miller's stomach lurched. He pressed his palms harder against the glass, whispering to his daughter through the barrier, "Come on, Emma. Fight, baby girl. Please fight." The twins moved faster now, their calm precision unshaken even as the stakes soared. Nurses rushed in with fresh supplies, bags of blood swaying in their hands, metal trays clattering as they landed on carts, and the room pulsed with a frenetic energy. Time warped, minutes stretching into an agonizing eternity. Miller's legs wobbled beneath him, his breath shallow and ragged, until Rachel's voice cut through the haze. "Bleeding's controlled. BP stabilizing." Relief crashed over him like a wave, and he sank into a chair, his knees buckling under the weight of it. Below, the twins shared a fleeting glance, a wordless acknowledgement of triumph, before returning to their work with renewed vigor. A soft voice broke his reverie. A young nurse, her face kind but weary, stood beside him. "Dr. Rachel asked me to bring you this," she said, offering a steaming cup of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in plastic. "She noticed you haven't eaten since this started." Miller took the coffee, its warmth seeping into his clammy hands, but the thought of food turned his stomach. "How long have they been at it?" he rasped, realizing time had slipped away from him entirely. 5 hours, the nurse replied, glancing at her watch. "Not a single break." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "We were all worried when we heard it was your daughter. The Carter sisters. They've had some rough run-ins with the police around here." Miller's grip tightened on the cup, the heat biting into his skin. "What do you mean?" he asked, though a sickening dread already coiled in his chest. The nurse shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to the floor. "Last year, Doctor, Sarah got pulled over 3 times in 1 week. One time, they made her lie face down on the pavement because they didn't believe her medical license was real. Dr. Rachel had to show up in her scrubs to prove who she was. The words landed like stones, each one heavier than the last. Miller's mind reeled. He'd done the same, hadn't he? Flagged people down, doubted their stories, questioned their legitimacy, all because of snap judgments he'd convinced himself were instinct. Through the glass, he watched Sarah adjust a light over Emma's surgical site, her movements fluid despite the hours of strain. Rachel leaned over the monitors, tracking brain pressure with an intensity that belied her exhaustion. There was no bitterness in their actions, no hesitation despite the man watching from above, the man who'd treated them like suspects instead of saviors. The monitors screeched again, and Miller's heart leapt into his throat as the team surged into motion once more. Blood pressure dropping, hemorrhage worsening, the chaos unfolded in a heartbeat, and he could only watch, terror rooting him to the spot. "Come on, Emma," he murmured, his voice breaking. The twins didn't flinch, their hands a whirlwind of skill and grace, pulling his daughter back from the brink with every stitch, every adjustment. When the storm finally passed, blood pressure steady, monitors quiet, Miller slumped back, drained but alive with gratitude. The nurse lingered, her voice soft. "I've worked with them 3 years. They're the best trauma surgeons we've got. But what sets them apart? After all they've been through, all the profiling, the disrespect, they never let it touch how they care for their patients, or their families." The words carved into him, exposing the rot of his own actions. He'd wielded his authority like a club, quick to judge, eager to dominate. Now he sat powerless, humbled by the very women he'd diminished. 7 hours after it began, Sarah stepped back from the table, her shoulders sagging as Rachel began closing Emma's incisions. The worst was over. The spleen removed, the brain swelling tamed, the bleeding staunched. Miller hadn't moved, his coffee cold, the sandwich untouched. Sarah peeled off her gown and mask, rubbing her bloodshot eyes, then made her way upstairs. She entered the observation room, her presence quiet but commanding. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice rough from hours of strain. "Emma's stable. We've done all we can for now. The next 24 hours are critical, but I'm cautiously hopeful." He rose on unsteady legs, his throat tight. "Thank you," he whispered, tears spilling over. "Thank you for saving her." Sarah's gaze softened, just a flicker, as she picked up Emma's chart to jot final notes. "She's a fighter, your daughter. Her vitals held strong even when things got dicey." Below, Rachel finished the sutures, her hands steady despite the toll of the night. Miller swallowed hard. "Dr. Sarah," he began, his voice trembling, "what I did today, how I treated you and your sister, it was wrong, completely wrong. I've been a cop for 15 years, told myself it was experience guiding me, but today, I saw the truth. I judged you because of prejudice, and I'm so ashamed." Sarah paused, her pen hovering over the chart, her face unreadable. Then she spoke, her tone measured but piercing. "You want to know the hardest part of medical school? It wasn't the endless studying or the brutal exams. It was walking into rooms where patients demanded another doctor. It was being mistaken for janitors in our white coats. It was getting stopped on our way to emergencies, proving over and over who we are." Miller stood there, stripped bare by her words, the weight of his actions crashing down. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about laws or badges. It was about the consequences of power wielded without thought. The twins had faced his worst and still saved his daughter, their skill a testament to resilience, their grace a lesson in mercy. As Sarah turned to leave, promising he'd see Emma soon, Miller knew her victory that night was only half the story. The deeper wound, the one within him, would take far longer to heal. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital courtyard as Rachel paused near a weathered bench, her gaze fixed on her sister Sarah working tirelessly below in the bustling emergency ward. The air hummed with the faint buzz of machinery and the distant murmur of voices, a symphony of life persisting despite the chaos. Rachel's chest swelled with a fierce determination that had been forged through years of whispered doubts and sidelong glances. She and Sarah had made a pact long ago, a silent vow etched into their souls. No one's ignorance or disdain would dim their light or keep them from becoming the finest doctors they could be. Every patient who crossed their path, every weary mother clutching a feverish child, every frightened soul who'd once spat venom their way deserved the fullness of their skill and compassion, no exceptions. Inside the hospital, Officer Miller sat hunched in a stiff plastic chair, his broad shoulders sagging under the weight of a revelation that clawed at his conscience. Tears brimmed in his eyes, hot and unbidden, as he replayed the moment he'd pulled the Carter twins over. The flashing lights of his cruiser still danced in his memory, a stark red and blue reminder of his snap judgment. "I held you up," he rasped, his voice trembling with regret. "My prejudice kept you from the hospital. If Emma had—" His words faltered, swallowed by the lump in his throat. Sarah cut him off, her tone steady but unyielding, a blade slicing through his self-pity. "She didn't. She's alive, Miller. And maybe, just maybe, something meaningful can rise from this wreckage." Her dark eyes held his, not with forgiveness, but with a challenge that pierced deeper than any accusation. The heavy door to the waiting room creaked open, and Rachel stepped inside, peeling off her sweat-dampened surgical cap. Her face was a map of exhaustion, lines etched around her mouth, shadows pooling beneath her eyes. But a quiet satisfaction glowed beneath the weariness. She'd just emerged from hours in the operating theater, her hands steady as they'd guided Emma back from the brink. "She's being moved to recovery," Rachel announced, her voice soft but firm. "Her initial post-op readings are solid, pulse steady, oxygen levels holding." Miller turned to face the sisters, his crumpled police uniform a testament to the endless hours he'd spent pacing these sterile halls. "I know words don't fix this," he said, his gravelly voice thick with emotion. "But I see you now, truly see you. And I'm not just talking change. I'm going to live it." The twins exchanged a glance, a wordless conversation that carried the weight of a lifetime spent navigating a world that too often refused to see them. Retell, Sarah's nickname from their childhood, broke the silence, her voice low and deliberate. "Actions drown out promises, Officer Miller. Prove it to us." Sarah nodded, her practical nature taking over. "The nurses will fetch you when Emma's ready for visitors. Try to rest. She'll need your strength when she wakes." As they turned to leave, Miller's voice chased after them, raw and desperate. "How do you do it? How do you keep pushing, keep caring, when people like me—" Sarah stopped at the threshold, her silhouette framed by the harsh fluorescent light. "Because every life counts, officer, even those who don't think ours do." With that, they slipped away, their white coats trailing like banners of resilience as they returned to Emma's side. Miller sank back into his chair, the room now eerily still save for the faint clatter of a janitor's mop against the tiled floor beyond the window. His daughter lived, breathed, because of two women he'd dismissed with a flick of his badge. Shame coiled in his gut, sharp and unrelenting as he fished his phone from his pocket. His thick fingers trembled as he tapped out an email to his precinct captain, each word a brick laid toward a new foundation. The department's training, its policies, they'd ossified into something rotten, and he'd been complicit. It was time to tear it down and rebuild. Later that night, the pediatric ICU hummed with the steady rhythm of beeping monitors and the soft hiss of ventilators. Miller was finally ushered in to see Emma, his boots scuffing against the polished floor as he approached her bed. She lay there, a fragile figure dwarfed by a tangle of tubes and wires, her once vibrant brown hair, meticulously braided for cheerleading practice that morning, now partially shaved, a stark patch of scalp gleaming under the dim lights. Rachel Carter stood sentinel at her bedside, her practiced hands adjusting a monitor as she tracked Emma's vital signs. Dr. Sarah hovered nearby, her brow furrowed as she scrolled through test results on a tablet, her exhaustion warring with her relentless focus. Her intracranial pressure's normal, Sarah reported, tilting the screen toward her sister. No swelling. Everything's holding steady. Rachel nodded, her fingers deftly tweaking an IV drip. Blood pressure's been stable for the last hour. That's a win. Miller lingered at the foot of the bed, his uniform wrinkled and reeking of stale coffee, watching the twins move in a seamless dance of competence. A faint moan broke the silence. Emma's fingers twitched, her eyelids fluttering like moth wings against the light. Miller lurched forward, his heart hammering. "Baby girl, can you hear me?" Sarah was at Emma's side in an instant, a penlight in hand, her voice gentle but commanding. "Emma, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand." She slipped her fingers into the girl's limp grasp, shining the light into each eye. A weak squeeze came, tentative but real, and Emma's eyes cracked open, confusion clouding her gaze. What happened?" she croaked, her voice a hoarse whisper scraped raw by the breathing tube. Miller's tears fell freely now, carving tracks down his weathered cheeks. "You were in an accident, sweetheart, but you're okay. These doctors, they saved you." Emma's bleary eyes drifted between the sisters. "Two of you?" she mumbled, her words slurring under the fog of anesthesia. "Am I seeing double?" Rachel's lips curved into a warm, tired smile. "We're twins. I'm Dr. Rachel, and this is Dr. Sarah. We've been looking after you." Emma's head lolled slightly, a faint spark of recognition flickering. "Like Jasmine and Jessica, the twins on my squad. Only black girls on the team." "Some people said they got in 'cause of diversity, but they're the best flyers we've got." Miller's chest constricted, his daughter's innocent words slicing through him like a blade. How many times had he muttered similar nonsense? How many times had he planted those seeds in her without even realizing it? Sarah checked Emma's pupils, her touch gentle but precise, while Rachel scribbled notes in the chart. "Getting on any team should be about talent," Sarah said softly, her voice a quiet rebuke to the world's noise. "Just like being a doctor should be about skill and grit, not the shade of your skin." Emma winced, her small hand lifting to her temple. "My head hurts." Rachel's tone was soothing, a balm against the girl's pain. "That's normal after what you've been through. You had a serious injury, but you're doing so well. We'll get you something for it." She adjusted the drip, and Sarah turned to Miller, her expression softening slightly. "She'll drift in and out for a bit, that's expected. One of us will check on her through the night." Miller nodded, gratitude lodging in his throat. "You must be dead on your feet. Can't someone else—" Sarah cut him off, firm but not unkind. "Emma's ours. We'll see her through until she's stable enough to move." As the pain meds took hold, Emma's eyes fluttered shut, her voice a sleepy murmur. "Dad, I'm here, baby," he whispered, leaning closer. "The doctors, they're like angels. 2 of them, watching over me." Miller watched her slip back into sleep, her face serene despite the bandages and bruises. He turned to the twins, these extraordinary women he'd wronged, who'd spent hours piecing his daughter back together and still stood vigil. "Angels," he echoed, his voice breaking. "She's right, and I was too damn blind to see it." The sisters shared a fleeting look but didn't pause, their hands moving over monitors and charts with practiced grace. Their silence spoke louder than any sermon. 2 doctors rising above the muck of bias to save lives, 1 heartbeat at a time. Miller sank into the chair beside Emma's bed, settling in for a long night of his own, knowing she rested in hands far better than he deserved. 3 days later, Emma had blossomed back to life, her recovery a quiet miracle. She'd been shifted to a regular room, its walls now adorned with cheerleading pom-poms and a cascade of get-well cards from her squad. The Carter twins still checked in, though the frantic urgency had eased as Emma's strength returned. That morning, Miller stood outside the hospital's main conference room, his palms slick with sweat as his own voice boomed from a video within. "I pulled over 2 doctors because of their skin. it declared, raw and unfiltered. "I delayed them from a critical surgery. That patient was my daughter, and my actions could have killed her." He'd spent the last 2 days hammering out this training session with hospital staff and his precinct, a reckoning he couldn't dodge. Inside, dozens of officers, some friends, some strangers, sat in tense silence, absorbing his testimony. The Carter twins flanked the front, their presence a quiet anchor as they'd agreed to join this unprecedented collaboration. Miller stepped in as the video faded, the room thick with unease. "That's my story," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "But it's bigger than me. It's every stop we make based on a hunch, every time we see a threat instead of a triumph, every second we let our baggage call the shots." Sarah rose, her poise commanding the space. 3 months ago, Rachel and I were stopped 4 times in a week, always on our way to or from this hospital. Each time, we had to prove we belonged. Rachel stood beside her, her voice calm but cutting. "We keep our IDs out, drive slow, hands in plain sight. Survival tricks we've mastered because we must. But we shouldn't have to." A young officer in the back piped up, his tone defensive. "What about crime stats? What about staying sharp in rough areas?" Miller met his gaze unflinching. "When's the last time you stopped a white doctor in a Lexus? When's the last time you doubted his credentials?" The room fell silent, the weight of justice and its failures hanging heavy. The Carter twins stood as living proof that power unchecked breeds ruin, but also that mercy and skill can mend what prejudice tears apart. Miller knew this was just the beginning, a single step toward a world where actions, not assumptions, defined the measure of a person. The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that presses against your chest as Officer Miller's words settled over everyone like a thick fog. The Carter twins, Dr. Sarah and Dr. Rachel, exchanged a fleeting glance, their dark eyes flickering with a mix of weariness and recognition. They'd sat through speeches like this before, heard every excuse and justification under the sun, but today felt different. Yesterday had been a whirlwind for Sarah. Her hands still carried the faint tremble of adrenaline from the emergency surgery she'd performed. The patient was a young black man, barely out of his teens, his body riddled with gunshot wounds. 2 officers, both now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, had dragged him into the ER, their faces tight with suspicion. One of them, a burly man with a buzz cut, had squinted at her scrubs and asked, "You sure you're qualified to do this?" The question had hung there, sharp and jagged, cutting through the chaos of the trauma bay. She didn't answer then. She didn't have time. She just kept working, her focus razor sharp, stitching life back into a body that prejudice had nearly claimed. Now, standing before the room, she let that moment linger in the air, her voice steady but laced with quiet fury. "That young man's alive today," she said, "because we don't let bias dictate who gets to live or die." Dr. Rachel stepped forward, her presence softer but no less commanding, her white coat swaying slightly as she moved. She wasn't here to point fingers or sling guilt. She'd seen enough of that in her years as a surgeon. "We're not here to tear anyone down," she said, her tone warm but firm. "We're here because people can change. Officer Miller proved it." At the mention of his name, Miller gave a small nod, his jaw tight with resolve. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn folder, its edges creased from hours of planning. "Starting today," he announced, his voice rough but determined, "our department's rolling out new training protocols. The Carters, both of them, have agreed to bridge the gap between us and the medical staff. Ride-alongs, hospital rotations, monthly meetings, it's all happening. Because the next time you pull over a black doctor, lawyer, student, or anyone else, you need to think twice. Your assumptions could kill someone." Sarah's gaze sharpened as she added, "Like they almost killed Officer Miller's daughter." The words landed like a punch, and Miller's face twitched with the memory. 6 months ago, he'd been a different man, quick to judge, slow to listen. That day, he'd stopped the Carter twins on a routine traffic check, his tone dripping with condescension as he questioned their credentials, their hurry, their very existence in his world. Minutes later, his radio crackled with the news. His daughter Emma had been in a car accident, her life hanging by a thread. The irony hit him like a freight train when he realized the suspicious women he'd delayed were the surgeons who would save her. That moment had cracked him open, exposing the rot of his own prejudice, and he'd spent every day since trying to claw his way out of it. The session stretched on for another hour, the air thick with tension and possibility. Some officers sat with crossed arms, their faces hard and defensive, muttering under their breath about woke agendas. Others leaned forward, brows furrowed, grappling with the stories the Carter twins shared. Stories of being followed in stores, questioned at traffic stops, dismissed in their own operating rooms. The twins spoke with a quiet power, their voices weaving a tapestry of pain and resilience. As the room began to empty, a soft creak broke the silence. Emma appeared at the door, her wheelchair guided by a nurse with steady hands. She was still frail, her skin pale against the hospital gown, but her eyes shone with a fragile strength. The sight of her stopped everyone cold. "I wanted to thank my angels again," she said, her voice trembling but bright, a smile tugging at her lips as she looked at the Carters. "And to see what my dad's been up to." Miller crossed the room in 3 quick strides, dropping to one knee beside her. He pressed a tender kiss to her forehead, then turned to face his colleagues, his voice low and raw. "This is what it's about," he said. "Not numbers, not stereotypes. It's about seeing people, really seeing them." The Carter twins moved to Emma's side, their movements fluid and practiced. Sarah knelt to check the surgical scars along Emma's abdomen, her fingers gentle but precise, while Rachel adjusted the IV line with a surgeon's steady grace. They didn't need words. Their skill, their poise, their unshakable dignity in the face of years of disrespect said everything. They were more than doctors. They were a living rebuke to every assumption that had ever been thrown their way. 6 months later, the auditorium at City General Hospital buzzed with energy. Rows of chairs were packed with police officers in crisp uniforms, medical staff in scrubs, local reporters scribbling notes, and community members craning their necks to see the stage. Officer Miller stood at the podium, his broad shoulders squared, his voice ringing out with a clarity that hadn't been there before. Behind him sat the Carter twins, their expressions calm but proud, and beside them was Emma, fully recovered, her cheerleading uniform a splash of color against the muted tones of the room. "Today," Miller began, "we're not just celebrating a training program. We're celebrating a shift in how we see each other. In 6 months, racial profiling complaints in our district are down 70%. Emergency medics haven't reported a single delay from police interference. But this isn't about stats." He paused, his eyes finding Emma in the crowd. "My daughter's alive because 2 incredible surgeons, 2 women I disrespected, 2 women I delayed, saved her. That day broke me, but it also rebuilt us." Dr. Sarah stepped up next, her white coat pristine, her posture radiating quiet authority. "When Officer Miller pitched this program, Rachel and I weren't sold," she admitted, her voice carrying a trace of skepticism softened by time. "We'd heard big promises before, empty words that never led anywhere. But this was real. This was action." Rachel joined her, her gaze sweeping the room. "We've had officers shadow us in the ER, watching us fight to save lives against the clock. They've seen what a few lost minutes can mean. And we've ridden with them, showing them who we are, not just surgeons, but Black women who've lived this reality our whole lives." From her seat, Emma beamed, her heart swelling with pride. She thought of her cheerleading teammates, Jasmine and Jessica, twins like the Carters, who no longer got pulled over on their way to practice, their laughter free of the old tension. She thought of herself, too, of the quiet biases she'd never noticed until her own life depended on seeing past them. The ceremony rolled on with awards and speeches, the ripple effects of that one terrible day spreading far beyond their city. Other hospitals were adopting the training model. Police departments from nearby towns sent delegates to take notes. Change wasn't just a buzzword here. It was a living, breathing thing, born from a moment of crisis and nurtured by people who refused to look away. Afterward, Miller found the Carter twins in a bustling hospital corridor, their scrubs already on for their next surgery. "You've done more than save Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've saved the soul of this department." Sarah adjusted her surgical cap, her eyes meeting his with a steady intensity. "Change starts small, Officer Miller. One person, one choice. You were ready to make that choice. Not everyone is, but the ones who are need to see it's possible." Rachel nodded, adding, "That's what this program does. It shows them the way." Emma appeared then, her stride confident, her cheerleading jacket slung over one shoulder. She'd faced death and come out stronger, a quiet fire burning in her now. "Dad," she said, tugging at his sleeve, "can we still get ice cream after my checkup next week?" He chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Of course, sweetheart. But first—" He turned to the twins as Emma pulled 2 small boxes from her jacket. Inside each was a silver pendant shaped like an angel's wing, glinting softly in the fluorescent light. "You called them angels that night," Miller said, his voice catching as he glanced at his daughter. "And they are," Emma finished, pressing the gifts into their hands. Angels in surgical caps. The twins accepted them with warm, surprised smiles, but a sharp beep from their pagers cut the moment short. "Duty calls," Sarah said, glancing at the message. "Multi-car accident coming in." Rachel smirked faintly. "No police escort needed this time. The roads are clear for us now." As they hurried toward the ER, Miller watched them go, his chest tight with a mix of gratitude and awe. 2 brilliant surgeons, 2 women who'd turned his worst mistake into a movement for justice. He thought about how close his snap judgments had come to costing him everything, how they nearly stole his daughter's life, and how the Carters had transformed that failure into something bigger. Emma slipped her hand into his, her voice soft but sure. "They're amazing, aren't they, Dad?" "They are, baby girl," he murmured, squeezing her hand. "They truly are." They headed toward the clinic for her follow-up, passing a new plaque mounted on the hospital wall. Etched in bold letters, it read, "Prejudice delays. Understanding saves lives." Below it, 2 footprints, a police boot and a medical shoe, marched forward side by side. What began as a story of a flawed cop and 2 resilient doctors had grown into something far greater. A beacon of change, a lesson in accountability, and a reminder that the abuse of power carries a cost, one that can only be paid through the hard, humbling work of seeing people as they truly are. In the end, it wasn't just Emma's life that was saved that day. It was the spark that lit a fire, one that would burn through ignorance and light the way for countless others, one changed heart at a time.